Firstly, Benny, that was a beautiful poem you just read. I love that very much, my sentiments. I was initially filled with trepidation when I accepted the the honour of speaking to you today at this conference. Trepidation quickly gave way to disbelief and finally fear when I realised just who had stood here before me. My dubious thanks then to Ruth and to Caroline for inviting me today. They're about to discover, like you are, that I'm just a simple pilot. I'm not a CEO in charge of 500,000 employees, nor am I a peer to the realm, nor am I a minister in charge of the country. All our previous speakers here. No, I'm just a simple search and rescue pilot who considers it a good start to the day if I manage to feed the cats and find a matching pair of bra and pants before leaving for work. It's a low level. Sirs, ma'ams, ladies and gentlemen, my bio describes me as a proud member of the RAF Search and Rescue Force, and that couldn't be more true. I'm proud of these medals, I'm proud of these, and I'm certainly proud of these wings. I'm stood here in my formal uniform rather than my usual flying suit, but both hold very overt visual representation. I'm equally proud, though, to belong to the transgender community. But for me, there's no overt symbology for that. To show this, I have to talk about it. In this company, having pride in that may seem very obvious, but apply that slightly wider outside of this room, and it may seem that it's not a traditional fit. I spent the first few years since my coming out as trans in a personal debate wrestling with whether to be out or go back into the closet. Many of my close friends advised that I should remain in the closet to avoid discrimination and for good reasons of personal safety. You know, you don't want to face bigotry, you don't want to face discrimination, and you certainly don't want to become known as just a trans person at the expense of everything else about you. Two things ultimately stopped me from hiding my transness. The first was the Sun newspaper, and more on that later. The second was the unblinking support of my employer, who have openly supported openly serving transgender individuals since 1999. I often tell the story which symbolises that for me perfectly, which is of the grizzled guard stood on the gates at RAF Valley on the day when I returned to work, presenting as myself, but with my old ID card in hand, which didn't exactly look like me. Bless him, he was the guy. He threw up a salute. He said, "Don't worry, Mum, you're not the first. You're not the first. You won't be the last. Good luck to you." What he didn't realise, and probably still doesn't, is the importance of simple actions like his and what they played in making it possible for trans people like me to even contemplate being open about that part of themselves. See, the important people in this aren't people like me, not really. The people surrounding me are allies, and you've probably spotted a theme from today. Allies are brilliant for a number of reasons, and if you suspect you might be an ally, it's a good thing, and I hope you know how important you are. It's very obvious for someone like me to stand up and advocate for trans issues, but the relationships a person has throughout their lives are just as important as the individual. Being trans stems from an innate sense of self, but is experienced externally. Dr. J. Stewart does a fantastic TED talk on this very subject and explains gender far more eloquently than I could. It's highly recommended viewing if you get the chance. Highlighting those positive relationships, be they professional, casual, romantic or otherwise, is a powerful statement, putting that person in context. By doing so overtly, even in very small and casual ways, each of you are in turn giving permission for others to do the same. The power of that can't be undersold. But it only works if the message is heard. With a subject as personal and sensitive as being transgender, where confidentiality and respect for personal boundaries are so important, but married to a minefield of terminology and differences in lived experience, it's actually understandable that many would feel unqualified to pass comment. It's just one reason why I felt a huge sense of progression when Ruth began Stonewall's move towards trans inclusion and the engagement with the trans community that led to that. I won't hold back in voicing my support for that process, the way it was conducted, and it can be a tricky road to begin. But we truly are stronger together, and I thank Stonewall for their vision. That, for me, is a sign of progression and evolution. A trans friend described my transition to me recently as a gold-plated transition. I've kept my career, my beautiful wife, her and my family's love and support, and so much more besides. In retrospect, I can say that, well, of course I kept those things. Why shouldn't I have? In the run-up to coming out, though, I felt that each and every one of those things could be very easily lost. I almost expected it. That I was left with no other way to continue life, in a very real sense, without being braced to lose each and every one of those things is small testament to the anguish that anyone else who's been through gender dysphoria will relate to. Everything I'd learned through my life about trans people, the subtle and overt jokes, the tabloid stereotype, the chat show victim story, the lack of anyone who was visible and hadn't lost at least some of those things alongside their personal dignity. That lifetime of education forced me to believe, above all other things, that I certainly could not be one of them. If I was, then I knew my fate. Except I did know some trans people who were living full and fairly normal lives, and some of them even worked in the same sector as me. They were quiet about it, as was befitting of the time, but in a small world I'd met them. I'm not sure they know just how important they were to saving my life. They gave me a glimmer of hope and of possibility. I remember vividly the weekends that I resolved to live the rest of my life as myself. My biggest fear, after trying everything I could to live as the male character everyone assumed I was, is that I could die one day without anyone having known who I was. Even those I loved the most would not have known me. That was the void that had been within me throughout my life, and always remained, even after ticking all of the boxes of success that I could find. And whatever I did to try and hide that fact, even from myself, that void remained. That same weekend, my parents called me and offered their unending support, whatever happened. My dad, bless him, had been on Google and researched everything. And during that telephone call, he proceeded to teach me everything he knew about being transgender. Thanks, Dad. I recognised instantly how fortunate I'd been. A huge slice of that was my family, my wife. But a key enabler was the unblinking support of my employer, who, it was their policy and 10 years of experience when I came out, and the ethos of the RAF that allowed me to transition so easily. I could ask my boss for a meeting, come out, simple. And while he looked at me with the expression that exclaims, "Look, I want to help you, but I've no idea how," I could hand him the policy documents and say, "Look, this is what could happen." I promised him as much support as I was asking from him and my colleagues. And from that day on, we proceeded with a ethos of honesty and pragmatism. He was my rock at work, and he remains one of the most natural leaders that I've had the privilege to work with. As an individual, as a unit, and as an organisation, we were served well by those policies. We moved on, and we came out the other side fitter for it. I went through the process of coming out to a few people at a time, wanting to use my own words and avoid the stereotyping that was prevalent, certainly at the time. It was very much my choice to come out, and not everyone chooses to. As good as they are, people are still people, and the rumour mill started to turn, and word got back to me that rumours were starting to circulate. My boss suggested that I speed up the process of coming out. I was on the road at the time, and I thought, what possible way could I find to reach as many people as possible? In my own words, Facebook. My boss later described this moment as going nuclear, and wasn't quite what he'd had in mind. I was pretty pleased with that coming out letter, actually. It was shared at my request widely and respectfully amongst my peers and friends. But it did mean that I received a call 48 hours later telling me that I would be on the front page of The Sun. I remember it clearly, 2010, and the other headlines of the day revolved around a general election. They say never read the comments, and they're absolutely right. But I don't know many people who don't. You can imagine them. My very existence was put up for public scrutiny. And the comments range from, how can someone so selfish be doing that job, to questioning my mental stability. I wasn't mentally unstable, and I had a doctor's note to prove it. I was just trans. I am, I fix, I move on. Always looking for a silver lining, though. There was ultimately an upside to this experience. I sought guidance from members of an organisation called Transmedia Watch, and was fortunate to become involved in Transmedia Action, and All About Trans as it evolved. Their approach to challenging attitudes within the media matched my own, and was very much on engagement and visibility rather than on chest poking. Literally, it was a case of come and have tea and cake, and come and meet a real trans person on a level playing field, and just explain that there's so much more they could be talking about. The response had been fantastic over the last 5 years, and has represented the growing confidence in and inclusion of trans people in UK society. People know a bit more about it now. They talk more freely about it. Trans people are confident, they're professionals. They love and they are loved. They don't just demand inclusion in society, they are society. Increasingly, the idea for a need for secrecy surrounding the subjects only serves to highlight a type of shame at being trans, which is certainly not justified. Not reading the comments is a suggestion I've stiffly ignored many times over the years since then, but doing so has let me witness a shift. Over time, the positive comments started to balance out the hate, and when reading the comments on current articles, I noticed that the fear and hatred of trans people is in the minority, and even better, it's often challenged. It's a crude measurement, but to me it's inspiring. Like many here, I get correspondence following this type of event from all sorts of people, from parents, kids, siblings, peers. When that message is from a teenager who takes the time to write me a message and say that they see a future now because they read a positive story, it makes everything worthwhile. If just one young person reads a positive story and has a future, then it's got to be good for everyone, however way you analyse it. I was fortunate, but extremely so. I was inherently protected by the RAF. Living on a base patrolled by military guards with guns is reassuring, to be honest. As is a media team on hand to offer advice. Once again, though, my fortune highlighted to me the lack of fortune that others experienced. There's been a lot of reporting recently on transgender teenagers who've taken their own lives. They were the people who didn't hear the messages that things can be okay, that it can work out, and in fact, this doesn't need to be a millstone to carry. All that's true in my world, the one that I've been blessed to experience, but was not true for any of the dozen trans-related teenage suicides reported this year alone. And that's just those reported, and just the ones who had lost all hope. In some very developed parts of the world, right now, there is a very real and current threat to alienate and even deny the very existence of trans people. People just like me. That's a strong message in its own right to kids growing up, trying to be honest with the world about themselves. If I'd been born in any of those states instead of the UK, I would barely have been allowed to be involved in society. That terrifies me as much as it baffles me. The It Gets Better campaign, Stonewall's Education for All, diversity role models, and many other similar messages are far-reaching. But we still see deliberate barriers put up to block that kind of message. Many of these kids whose deaths were reported recently heard it, but didn't believe it, over the messages telling them that they shouldn't exist. Allies are critical at this time. Young people particularly, especially those working out their gender or their sexuality, need to hear the message clearly, consistently, and from as many of us as possible, that the finest way to stick two fingers up to those who would crush your spirits is to live and to live well. I'm not alone. I'm constantly inspired by the many trans men and women who I get to meet, who have the confidence and the mutual support to be open and honest about that part of their lives, unashamed of being trans. Most importantly, I've been struck by the diverse backgrounds and talents that these people have, and how impressive they are as individuals. What's being recognised now is that, both within and out with the community, in fact, is that trans people are not being trans is not something to be overcome. Being trans is something to be embraced and an experience in self-awareness that adds true value to the individual. Employers take note. They exemplify to me not just the history that's led us up to today, but the strong future that we have. So many of them standing as excellent representations of what being trans means in the 21st century. Trace Lizette is the most recent actress you'll probably hear about, for example, who's been working in Hollywood for years, but has only recently come out as being transgender. She follows the footsteps of Laverne Cox and Jazz Jennings, who's a teenager recently picked up by Clean and Clear as a model for them. All wonderful and fearless ambassadors for the transgender community. After ambassadors, though, people need to trust that if they choose to come out, we've got their back. Diversity is an active process. Sometimes after these type of events, I'm left with a wonderful sense of community, but left wondering, okay, what next? I was fortunate to be involved in the Stonewall Leadership Programme last year, and at the end of that we were asked to make a statement and a promise. Mine was that I would stop apologising. Transgender is not a phrase that should be mumbled by anyone. I promised to stop apologising. Each person, each trans person, has an inherent capability to be a role model in their own right. Each person connected to them, each person who reads a story and comments positively, each are role models. We can afford to be vocal about that. I'm proud to belong to a community, an organisation and a nation showing just what's possible when the wonderful diversity of human nature is embraced. I said that I was a simple pilot, and I really am. In search and rescue, we regularly find ourselves working with other units from organisations that we have no direct contact with. We all turn up with different processes, capabilities, and very different organisational structures. But in the moment, we all have the same focus. Just like many organisations and individuals represented here today, and coining a phrase that's been used in SAR a few times in recent years, we come together to bring hope to those who have none. Thank you.